Hey, I'm Eve Williams and I have a degree in English Literature from the Queen's University of Belfast and a Master's in Old English, which is all things Beowulf and saints' lives and that kind of thing. I'm also the teacher on one of the biggest courses in English literature on the web, which you'll find on SkillShare, Udemy and my own website. So links to all that below, but that's not what you're here for. Do you really want to be conversant in English literature? Do you want to be able to make witty, pithy remarks about some of the key texts of English literature at dinner parties? Well, that's what you're in store for in this really short video. So let's start with the big one, Hamlet. Basically, it's about a prince whose dad has been killed by his uncle who poured poison in his ear so that he could marry his wife and become king. Hamlet, of course, should be king because he was the prince, but he's either completely barking mad or he's pretending to be, which is a good way to keep himself alive. A few unfortunate things happen during this play. He accidentally kills his love interest's father, and then she genuinely goes nuts and drowns herself, and pretty much everybody dies at the end. The original version of Hamlet that we have the text for would have taken 8 hours to perform, so it's never really performed in its entirety. It's usually abridged in some way. Okay, now to the second text, The Great Gatsby. An absolute classic of American literature, and its narrator, Nick, is thought to be based on its author, F. Scott Fitzgerald. Now, The Great Gatsby is about a slightly patronising and condescending guy who goes on holiday to stay with relatives one summer in New York. Well, he's kind of got a job there as well. His name is Nick. He's got a reason for looking down on everybody around him though, because his family, his cousin Daisy and her husband Tom, are crashing snobs who, in the words of Fitzgerald, they were careless people, Tom and Daisy. They smashed up things and people and then retreated back into their wealth or their vast carelessness or whatever it was that kept them together. Now, I'm sorry if I've quoted that wrong. I don't have the quote in front of me. That's just off the top of my head. So yeah, The Great Gatsby is James Gatz, who has somehow made a fortune, probably in some dodgy way, and reinvented himself as J. Gatsby. He lives on an island opposite Daisy's island because he's fancied her for years and he just can't get over her, which is a shame because she doesn't really deserve him. Her husband is having an affair with a mechanic's wife. She gets run over, Gatsby gets shot. I'm sorry, can't talk about it without spoilers. He's the only decent person in the whole novel and he's creamed at the end. It's really a very tragic ending, apart from the little green light that flashes across the sea, which represents hope. It's a short novel, but there's a lot in it. It's really packed with imagery, and if you want to be able to talk about American literature, it's probably a good place for you to start. The biggest novel in English literature, if you take the English literature canon as a guide, Charles Dickens's Great Expectations. So you've got this bloke called Pip. As a kid, he meets a con on the lam and sort of helps him out, and then he disappears for the rest of the novel. Pip meets this lady called Miss Havisham, who is really, she's as mad as a box of frogs. Her wedding didn't come off. She was jilted at the aisle, so she's like frozen in time, and she's brought up a very pretty young girl called Estella to be her revenge on men. Of course, Pip really falls for Estella, and he's quite delusional about the whole thing. He knows he's got this secret benefactor and he thinks it's Miss Havisham and he's meant to end up with Estella, but no, it's the ex-con who's been keeping an eye on him. Sorry, again, another spoiler. The funny thing about Great Expectations is that it doesn't actually really have a concrete ending. It's got a very ambiguous final sentence which allows you to kind of interpret the way that you want it to end. And now we're on to number 4, Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. All Jane Austen's novels are basically the Cinderella story, where the heroine ends up with a man who's way above her in terms of social status. Jane Austen herself didn't feel the need to find a man to make money. She wrote books instead, and good for her. Pride and Prejudice is about 2 people, one of whom may be the pride and one of whom may be the prejudice. That's a loose way of interpreting it. One is Elizabeth Bennet and the other is Mr. Darcy. And everybody, when they hear the word Mr. Darcy, well, if you're of my generation, you think of Colin Firth jumping into that pond. Oh yes. So Again, it's about the machinations of the women as they try to like pair people off, get them set up. It's got a very famous first line. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a large fortune must be in want of a wife. So, as is the way in these Cinderella stories, this pair kind of fancy each other, but she thinks that he is a crashing snob and then considers her and her family to be beneath him. And there's a whole kind of complicated thing where her sister runs off with a member of the military and nearly really ruins the whole family because, you know, the scandal of it, which would have meant that none of the sisters could have been married. That all gets resolved and they all kind of slightly live happily ever after, you imagine, but really Lizzie's prejudice against Mr. Darcy and all her ill thinking against him dissipates when she sees his massive gaff called Pemberley, which is a pretty kicking estate, which she becomes the lady of. Now for a very different classic that tends to be loved by women, myself included. We're going to talk about Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. Very different from Pride and Prejudice, which is sort of all about manners and the rules of society. This is all about passion and ghosts and digging up dead bodies. A lot of gothic stuff going on in this novel. But basically, Cathy lives in a house high on a hill in the Yorkshire moors, Wuthering Heights, where the wind blows. And her father brings home an orphan one night. He is kind of like taken into the household, they fall in love, she marries someone else, she dies after having a child, he digs her up 18 years later to look at her corpse, their kids end up getting married and it's all a nightmare. It's dark stuff, but it's really, really gripping. So I hope you're going to enjoy Wuthering Heights. Now we're going to talk about the Romantics. So basically, the Romantic poets doesn't mean that they wrote flowery, soppy Valentine's card stuff. Romanticism was a literary movement sweeping Europe at the time. In English literature, there are two generations of Romantics. The first generation are sort of exemplified by William Wordsworth. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, etc., etc. And Samuel Coleridge, he of the famous opium addiction. They didn't have their troubles to seek the Romantics half the time. He wrote, of course, Kubla Khan and The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Together they wrote a really famous collection of poems called Lyrical Ballads. Now, they came to their worldview by observing the French Revolution, which was the big thing happening in Europe at the time, a complete change in social order. But they became completely nauseated by the violence of it. You know, the whole reign of terror thing? Not good. And so they went to see it, they were horrified, changed their minds a bit. The second generation didn't, and they were still very much radicals, despite the fact that they were mostly toffs who'd sat in their ass for most of their lives. These are people like John Keats. Actually, he wasn't too bad in the toffs stakes. George Gordon, Lord Byron, known as mad, bad and dangerous to know. He could be a little bit of an arse when it came to the way that he treated women. And of course, Percy Bysshe Shelley. So he got a cracking good wife in Mary Shelley, who was a daughter of famous feminist Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Women, and of William Godwin. Now, they were very anti-marriage. They thought marriage was a very restrictive institution until the time that Percy Bysshe Shelley announced to William Godwin, "I'm running off with both your daughter and another member of your family," at which case apparently Godwin responded by drawing a poker from the fire, thus rescinding a lifetime's worth of thinking. Mary Shelley, of course, wrote Frankenstein. It's a story that hasn't had a lot of favours done to it by Hollywood adaptations, but you know the whole thing. Frankenstein is not the monster. Frankenstein is the creator. He digs up a dead body, revives it. It's a bit of a monster, doesn't feel that it fit into society, gets a bit lonely, various people get killed. This novel was basically written in response to Percy Bysshe Shelley's Prometheus Unbound, which is all about the Greek myth of Prometheus who steals fire from the gods in order to try and create life and is punished for it. And she answers him back and said, well, if we could create life, it wouldn't be a real life. It would be a horrible sort of bastardization of a life. And so from a ghost story that she had told one night, she wrote this very famous novel. The Romantic period is actually more famous for poetry than for novels, but Romantic novels do tend to be gothic and dark, such as Frankenstein and Matthew Gregory Lewis's The Monk. So if you like sort of soft porn with some horror in it, go read The Monk. So now let's talk about a book that I truly adore, and I'm pretty sure that a lot of you do too, The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. So Tolkien had a very, very close mate called C.S. Lewis, you might have heard of him, who helped him launch a children's book in the 1930s called The Hobbit. It did really well and the publisher wanted a sequel, so instead of writing another children's book, he wrote a 1,000-odd page epic with so many characters that they are basically countless, where you have to actually draw maps in your head while you're reading it to see how all the characters interact with everybody else. The world that he created, Middle-earth, has a very, very complex history. It has a whole lot of languages of its own. It really does feel like entering into another world. But at the centre of it is this little guy called Frodo, who comes from a race known as the Hobbits. They inhabit a place which seems very much like England. They're very insular, they like a good old drink, they like a good old gossip, they like to do pretty sedate, calm things, but unfortunately there is this magic ring which would give a Dark Lord the power to take over the world, which is not really a good thing. And so Frodo has accidentally come into possession of this ring, so he and his gardener, Sam, head off to try and destroy. Well, at first they don't know they're going to destroy the ring. They think they're just going to get it to somebody else who'll deal with it, but that turns out to be not so simple. So they end up on an epic 1,000-page quest. A lot of characters they meet along the way. They meet the lost king of men who's restored to the throne, Aragorn. They meet Galadriel, who is basically the Virgin Mary, because Tolkien was a very committed Catholic. In this story, they meet other elves, they meet dwarves. It's just like entering into a fairy tale. It was actually first sold in a Catholic bookshop as a religious work. Just a little fact there. And J.R.R. Tolkien himself described it as a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, unconsciously so at first, but consciously so in the revision. It took him 16 years to write it. Now, if we're talking about romantic poetry, it's hard to beat The Lady of Shallot by Alfred Lord Tennyson. It's about this lady who sits on an island, weaving, and she can only see the outside world by looking in the mirror, because if she actually turns around and looks out the window, she'll die. Then Sir Lancelot rides by. He's pretty hot and something to look at, so she does walk away from her loom, looks out the window, and she does die. Well, she doesn't die immediately though. She floats up the river in a boat and dies, and he finds her dead body. Sounds a bit gothic, but it actually comes over as really romantic in the poem, and it takes, a good few hundred lines to tell this quite simple story. But I really do recommend reading The Lady of Shallot. The last book that we're going to talk about is The Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer. This is a classic of medieval English literature, later medieval English literature. Basically, it's a collection of tales about different characters, and they're all a little bit dodgy in their way. It mentions scams, it mentions farting, it mentions fights, all on pilgrimage to Canterbury. So in a way, not much has changed since medieval times. Some of the characters are very comedic, some of them are a little bit dark, but the pardoner's tale is very, very close to the story that you get in Harry Potter about the Deathly Hallows, and worth reading to see how it seems to have really, really influenced J.K. Rowling. So I hope that you've enjoyed this quick synopsis of some of the classics of English literature, and that next time someone wants you to prove that you're well read, that you'll have something to say.